You can see smoke and fires still on the streets of Northern Ireland's capital. This follows the vicious stabbing of a man earlier by a Sudanese migrant.
Welcome to Capitals Uncovered. This is the week when there's an incredibly important by-election in outside Manchester, where Andy Burnham is the prince across the water, is trying to get into power, or at least get into Parliament, which would offer him a shot at power. And if there's a challenge to Keir Starmer, he needs 80 MPs to be behind him. And then you've also got the little crown prince of Tony Blair, whose name just temporarily escapes me. What's his name?
West Streeter?
Yeah, West Streeting. So it'll be a three-way if the leadership election takes place, and maybe more people piling in. But we don't know yet. And of course, Andy Burnham has to win the election. Now, he is favourite to win at the moment, but only because Restore Britain, the more right-wing alternative to the Reform Party, are leeching votes off Reform. So I've got friends who are out there campaigning for Reform, and they're saying that on the doorstep everyone they meet says that they know that Restore is basically doing Labour's job for them, but they don't care. They're going to vote for Restore anyway, because Restore actually talks about repatriation of people, and Reform is more moderate. So the opposition is going to be divided. The people who vote for less immigration are going to be divided between Reform and Restore, and that's going to let in Andy Burnham, and Andy Burnham's then going to challenge Keir Starmer. So the question lends itself to those who are conspiratorial minded, and we are conspiratorial minded, is if the Tories or someone else, maybe even Labour, are kind of backing the Restore Party to sort of to hobble Reform's chances. That's what's happening in Manchester. What's happening elsewhere in Britain is that there are demonstrations everywhere. It's summer, for God's sake, and it's becoming a regular feature of the summers outside refugee hostels, and a particularly strong place where riots or refugee protests are taking place is in Northern Ireland. And who better to talk about what's going on in Northern Ireland, where Protestants and Catholics seem to have united on a cause for the first time in 400 years, namely non-European immigration. It's a very interesting story there. And Martin, take it away.
Thank you very much, Pelle. I mean, it really is home ground for me. The rioting in Northern Ireland, first of all, is not huge. It is tiny. And I think you probably have a much better perspective of that over in Europe, and perhaps they do in Britain. Or perhaps, correct me on this, are they inflating it? Is it being played up? Because I hear directly from people on the ground in Belfast, not just old geezers like myself, but from the people young enough to be my children and grandchildren. And what I hear is very clear. The rioting is real. The resentment against lawlessness and what you've seen in the immigrant community. It's not typical of the immigrant community, but it comes from it. And as always happened, it's a pattern you saw back with Jack the Ripper in the 1880s. When there are even one or two crimes that are monstrous or striking from a new alien immigrant community, the whole community, most of whom are indeed law-abiding and very grateful to be there, get blamed and polarized from it. Now, in 1888, during the Jack the Ripper murders, the British police and establishment, far from playing up violence, worked extremely hard to protect immigrant communities, especially the Russian Jewish immigrants and Polish Jewish immigrants who'd fled the pogroms and massacres in Russia. And even though their primary suspect was indeed, he was never convicted, but he died in custody. Mr. Kaminsky, they worked overtime to damp down speculation or even the realization who the primary suspect was, because they didn't want rioting to spread out of control around the country. Now, I think the British deep state and security services, they have the same priority. They are very understaffed. The police are understaffed, as you well know. They've been feminized with insanely liberal policies, not just so under the current government, but under both Conservative and Labour governments as a matter of liberal culture, going back now 50 years and 60 years and more. Margaret Thatcher tried to turn back that particular tide to protect people of all backgrounds in Britain from predators, but she was only able to go so far. And since her time, as you know, it's been appeasement all the way. That's the underlying factor. So resentment has built up in Britain, as you know. But what the deep state wants above all is to prevent a black-white civil war, partly because, again, from their woke point of view, they are determined to protect colored and immigrant communities. There is a line in the Bible, which fundamentalists like to use a lot, that if you don't follow the laws of God, you will sink lower and lower. I think it's in the book of Leviticus, and the stranger among you will rise higher and higher. Well, here it's not that the stranger, quote unquote, the immigrants are forcing themselves even to do that. It's that the white, old-fashioned liberal elite themselves are repressing the long-established communities, white and long-established immigrant as well. And this is causing enormous resentment. What you're seeing in Belfast is a spillover of this. And you've seen the same thing in riots in Dublin and the south of Ireland. As you've said, this is something I didn't expect to see in my lifetime. I've worked all my life for the peace process in Ireland, for an Ireland that is at peace with itself, that is at peace with Britain and England as well. That is a respected member of the European Union, which the Republic of Ireland certainly is. Northern Ireland has been to a great, enormous degree as well. The peace process has been wonderful for Northern Ireland. But at the same time, I felt it could come back at any time, just as it came back when I was a boy after decades of peace and prosperity. The worst rioting and civil war in Northern Ireland's history erupted in the late 1960s and did not begin to get under control until the mid-1980s. And therefore, having been burned by that as a boy, I thought it can come back at any time. But now what are we seeing? We're seeing what may not be, but it could be the beginning of a long-term positive solution, but for dark reasons too, to the Protestant Catholic divide in Northern Ireland. After centuries of hatred on both sides, going back 400 years now and more, what are we seeing? We're seeing the hardcore elements that used to specialize in killing each other in both the working class Protestant and Catholic communities, joining forces against what they see as a mutual threat. And it's a slightly subtle threat. It's not just, that we hate all Muslims. They don't hate all Muslims, but they hate immigrant communities who come in, who rape and kill their women and try to behead their men or succeed in doing so. It's a very visceral thing, because there were rioting a few months back in Northern Ireland, not against Muslim people or Pakistani people or black people, but against Romanian workers who had been accused, and I think had either not been convicted or had been let off, very likely with a sentence. I stand to be corrected on the details, on a case of a particularly shocking rape of a teenage girl in Northern Ireland. And this outraged people alike from the Protestant and Catholic communities. And that's the motivation behind the rioting in Short Strand on the banks of the River Lagan, or just at the bottom of the Newton-Ards Road, which has been described. That's point one. There is, however, other points. First, the rioting is extremely narrow and limited in its scope. Northern Ireland is not up in flames. England is in threat of going up in flames in civil war. And American theorists who love their theories, and I have applied, and I've seen in action, the theories of fourth generation war and fifth generation war, which are both of them extremely important and vital to understand and apply for the preservation of Western civilization. I don't want to sneer at them or belittle them or discredit them in the slightest. On the contrary, the men who formulated those models have been very dear friends to me, and I admire and respect them greatly. And not just I admire them as people, I admire them as soldiers, as intellectuals, as analysts, as dedicated patriots, dedicated to preserving not just the best of America and the best of England and Britain and Ireland, but also the best of Western civilization. So, but even there, some of them are now making the mistake of applying their models in total ways in Northern Ireland. Oh, the British deep state must be behind the anti-Muslim rioting. I don't see that at all. On the contrary, I think the British deep state is appalled by the latest riots in Northern Ireland because they correctly see it as part of what is happening in Britain. And they can't control what is happening in Britain. All their usual methods of reassurance, of brainwashing, of discrediting, of dividing and ruling are breaking down. I don't want to see Restore come to power in Britain. I don't see any group in Britain that I would like to see taking over, and perhaps we can discuss that in a couple of minutes too. The current Prime Minister, Mr. Sir Keir Starmer, is of course a total washout. He's totally useless. But although Andy Burnham was very successful, Andy Burnham might be in theory, the best bet for tranquilizing Britain and bringing a short-term peace between the communities. But he's already indicating strongly that he wants to make the idiot Ed Miliband, the current Minister for Energy Security and Net Zero, an Orwellian term if ever there was one, Chancellor of the Exchequer, Finance Minister of Britain. And if that happens, the economic collapse of England and into total destitution and despair, whether you're white or black or rich or poor or Muslim or Christian or secular, it makes no difference. Those policies are totally insane, and they are going to bring misery and suffering to all the poor people in Britain, whatever their background is. So I see no hope, really. I'd like to see some hope with Andy Burnham. But I don't really. As for Nigel Farage, he's a worthless liar and a demagogue, and I think he's been co-opted by the deep state. They're clearly very comfortable with him. Restore is grassroots, but Restore, from my perspective, goes much too far, is much too ugly. I do oppose forcible repatriation of any community. If people understandably see the country going down, and I think actually people of white and black backgrounds alike, both families that go back forever in Britain and people who came back 20 or 30 years ago, it makes sense to get from people to leave Britain, because that's the best way for England and Britain to survive. You have 75 million people in an island that can only grow enough food in the best of times for 15 million people, and the society has to import the rest at a time when international trade flows and supply chains are breaking down. This is a recipe for catastrophe, and that applies to everyone in Britain. But the Restore model, forcibly to poor people, guarantees racist civil war and massacres on both sides. And I've covered the world. I've seen ethnic massacres around the world. I wish I'd seen less of them or none of them. I don't want to see them in Britain. I don't want to see them in America or in Western Europe. I want the best ways to avoid them. And for me, Restore is the worst solution. But it's even worse than Keir Starmer, which I would have thought impossible to conceive. But in Northern Ireland, the key point, one last point, and that is applying more sophisticated models that, fourth generation war, fifth generation war, the CIA is doing it, the KGB, or whatever the Russians call it today, are doing it, or MI5, a special secret intelligence service, are doing it. No, I mean, no doubt people will have their hands in. I see that possibly with this new so-called Republican group that has appeared from nowhere. I think that might be a British front to try and assassinate some Protestant leaders, simply in order to distract the Protestants against the Catholics, because that's what the British deep state is comfortable with,
Right.
discrediting Republicans, seeing Protestants and Catholics fight each other.
Mm.
That's a possibility. But A, it hasn't happened yet. And B, the rioting in Northern Ireland so far is very entertaining. Everybody outside wants to get their oar in and have apply models that apply in huge scale correctly in Europe and England and America. But on this tiny scale in Belfast, it doesn't apply at all. I know those streets backward. I had an uncle and aunt who ran a fish and chip shop in one of the blocks that has since been burned down 70 years ago, when they were serving thousands of customers every day who were workers in the Belfast shipyard in those days. Carleton Wolf and Queen's Island. My uncle and aunt closed their shop because they were victims of the shutdown they were victims of free trade. British shipbuilding wasn't protected against international rivals. So the great shipyard closed down. So the 20,000 shipyard workers lost all their jobs. And my uncle and aunt lost the markets who they'd supplied for 10 or 20 years. Fish and chips too. It affects everyone. But I know those streets. And what's happening there is on a tiny scale. Northern Ireland is not breaking out again into civil war. But it is a symptom of the wider anti-ethnic conflict and of the rise of Restore in England. It's a symptom of that same process.
Well, it's interesting. Well, first of all, David Betts is a guy who's popular on the podcast. He's actually with King's College, which is a hive of the deep state, basically. You know, it trains a lot of people. So how he managed to keep his position there is a wonder. But anyway, he's been predicting a civil war in the UK for a long time. And you might say that, I mean, Northern Ireland, especially Northern Ireland Protestants, have produced some of the best generals and fighters that Britain has ever seen.
Oh, yes.
I mean, I noticed that I've been to Northern Ireland 2 or 3 times. And so my knowledge of it is a fraction of yours. But an outsider can also have interesting perspectives. And what struck me is that seeing these RUC men at the airport, that Royal Ulster Constabulary, with their twirly moustaches, they had a bearing that you didn't see on the mainland. You know, there's a kind of swagger about them that you just don't see. And they look at you in a sort of baleful, suspicious way. And then I remember seeing them in Ballymena walking 3 or 4 abreast with their machine guns. There is a warrior culture there that's disappeared from the mainland. And there's people on the right, I think I'm a bit more right-wing on this issue than you are, who say that, you know, if Britain's going to recover its mojo, it's going to be in Northern Ireland, because that's where there's a martial culture and a recent history.
I'm with you 100%.
A history of violence against the state and against the But the other thing is, so it's interesting that well, I just want to say Burnham versus Starmer. And we'll bring in the other big story, which is, of course, war in Ukraine. And I think that you know, John Healey and his sidekick, Al Carnes, that they left office last year to sort of hold Starmer below the waterline, because the defense secretary has had a much more aggressive stance on Russia than Starmer. And actually that makes me think well of Starmer, because if the deep state and the military people hate him because he's not going far enough against Russia, then he's a man worth preserving in office. Because obviously they're trying to get rid of him, and because apparently the net increase in the defense budget is practically zero, you know. So he's obviously being tugged by the left in his cabinet, probably Ed Miliband and Rachel Reeves, and they might be under siege from the defense and the MI6 and MI5 and Whitehall, you know. And obviously they have an interest. I think they want a replacement for Starmer, and somebody who's going to do their bidding against Russia, and they will maneuver someone into position that will replace Starmer and will do their bidding. And to me, I don't know, Burnham seems to be, he's obviously, you can't make a career in British politics by saying you want peace in Ukraine. So I don't know if they want to replace him with Burnham, but maybe they want to replace him with Streeting, who's more biddable and younger and less knowledgeable about everything and associated with.
I agree.
So that's that factor as well. But I also agree that they are horrified by these things, a deep state, and they don't want a civil war in Britain, obviously. And it's also, just to pick up one of the things that you said, was that they might well, I mean, it's divide and conquer all the time, isn't it? So their interest is in stopping a united front of Protestants and Catholics. And they
Exactly.
do that by sponsoring a so-called fringe group or something to start killing some Protestants. So they get back to the good old game of Protestants and Catholics killing each other rather than turning on the migrants.
I
Yeah,
100% agree
yeah,
with you. And
yeah.
if I may also, the loyalists in Northern Ireland, as you say, a proud militarist culture. But when crossed, they will turn against the Brits as they did in 1912, as some of them tried to do in a very inept way in the late 1960s and early 70s. But fundamentally and overwhelmingly, they're enormously loyal to Britain and England and the Crown, and always have been. They're an honor culture. Which has both positive and negative aspects to it, you might say, but you have to understand it and respect it and recognize it for what it is. And on the other side, Irish Catholics are that way too, especially in the north. Enormous numbers, scores of thousands of Irish Catholics died fighting for Britain in World War One.
Mm.
The rate of volunteer soldiers from Catholic soldiers from Ireland who fought in the British Army and volunteered to fight the British Army and did so through World War II with impeccable records is enormous. But there is another statistic which confirms, I think, your insight dramatically, Pelle, and it's this. 1940-45, Britain's greatest war, World War II. Population of the United Kingdom, 46 million. Population of Northern Ireland, 1.5 million, of whom only 1 million, it's somewhat lower, I think, now, were Scots-Irish Ulster Protestant Unionists, right? 1 million out of 46 million in the United Kingdom. Number of field marshals in the British Army, commanding the army, the equivalent of a five-star general in the United States, or a marshal of France, or the Soviet Union, or Russia. 8. Number of those field marshals in the British Army who came from Northern Ireland, 7. 7 out of 8.
Wow.
And it included all the best ones. The 4 outstanding, top, brilliant, magnificent British generals of the war. Montgomery, Alamein in Western Europe, Field Marshal Bill Slim in Burma, remarkable campaign, still virtually unknown outside cognoscenti, but there's no secret or cover-up about it. It's just people don't pay attention to it. The top British soldier of the war, the man who prevented Winston Churchill losing the war repeatedly with his half-brained schemes, and Churchill hated him for it. Chief of the Imperial General Staff, Field Marshal Sir Alan Brooke, who became Lord Alan Brooke. Again, Northern Irish. Aristocrat and tough as nails, and the general who who became General George Marshall's best friend, and the two of them basically ran Allied strategy in the West together outstandingly out of Washington in the war. And Churchill hated this British general for it. He had fired him already as chief of the Imperial General Staff, and then find himself saddled because the Americans thought the world rightly of him. And that was Field Marshal Sir John Dill, whose background was also ultimately Anglo-Irish aristocratic. And Alan Brooke and Montgomery in particular always looked up to Dill, who had even tutored them at War College 20 years earlier as their mentor. And they all came from the same tiny community in Northern Ireland. And I grew up in that community. I've been back and worked there for years. I had friends on both sides of the divide. And you find first on the Protestant side, in the security forces, that burring, that pride, that formidableness that you don't fool around with. We treat it very much the same thing you find in the old classic John Ford, John Wayne westerns, or Howard Hawks westerns. We'll treat you with dignity and restraint and respect, but we demand that from you. And if you sneer at us or underestimate us, it may well be the last thing you ever do. That attitude. And you see it on the Irish Republican side as well. Conor Cruise O'Brien writes about this and used to talk about it a lot. As a Southerner who discovered, to his horror and often fear, The formidable nature of the people of Northern Ireland, both Protestant and Catholic. He came from the Catholic background, of course, in the Republic himself. And he said when the Troubles began in the 60s, a certain sense of unease eventually spread among in peaceful, democratic, law-abiding Irish Republic. It wasn't just that the Protestants of the North were much tougher and more numerous and more clearly dangerous than we in the South, from a safe distance, had always comfortably assumed them to be. It was that when we looked at our own folks up north, the Northern Irish Republican community, the Catholic community, my God, they're not like us either. They're as tough and mean as the Protestants are, which, of course, you had to be to survive. Mm-hmm. But that was the state there. And now to have people in both those communities sharing common cause. Mm-hmm. And again, what's as you pointed out, what is the default position, the instinctive position of the British deep state, of the security services? A combination of racism and ingrained dirty tricks and bad habits that were applied to, of course, a quarter of the surface of the world and more during the hundreds of years of the British Empire. And where's the last place they can still play with them, the game that way, in Northern Ireland? Divide and rule. Manipulate them, play them against each other, set up tiny little ridiculous fake Protestant and Catholic extremist groups to kill one or two people on both sides, so you can stir up the old sectarian hatreds again. When I heard these stories when I was young, I didn't believe them. When I heard them in bars, Irish bars in America when I came over here, I didn't believe them. But when I see, there are first-class journalists. I mean, this has been documented above all. Hopefully, we could even get him as a guest on our show. I wish we could. Martin Dillon, who has been monitoring this stuff for half a century and who wrote a definitive book on it, The Dirty War. Anyone interested in this subject who wants to get beyond American theories and see what actually has been done in detail, in reality, in Northern Ireland, on a very tiny scale, but it's revealing.